Renewed hope for stalled nuclear talks. Iran agrees to allow IAEA maintenance work on cameras at nuclear facilities. Could that pave the way for getting the nuclear deal back on track? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Iran's nuclear dispute. The International Atomic Energy Agency is meeting in Vienna with Iran's nuclear program at the top of its agenda. And for the first time in a long time, it seemed the UN nuclear watchdog had some positive news to share. The IAEA reached an agreement with Iran over monitoring the country's nuclear facilities, resolving one of their more serious disputes. The government, under new President Ebrahim Raisi, agreed to allow international observers to restart surveillance cameras in their nuclear facilities. The breakthrough came on Sunday following a last-minute trip to Tehran by nuclear watchdog chief Rafael Grossi. Their agreement met the minimum requirement for talks to resume in Vienna and likely saved Iran from censure over violating its international obligations. But at Monday's IAEA board meeting, the Director General admitted there's still a long way to go.
For the time being, we have not received the kind of feedback that we need. So at this point in time, with a new government, and as you know, with a government that has quite firm views on matters related to the nuclear program, the past, the present, and the future, I, as Director General, need to sit down with them, tell them how I see the whole picture, and tell also what I expect from them, and to hear from them as well. So I did not get any promises. One thing I got is the agreement that this is something that needs to be done, and this is why I hope to be very soon in Tehran to have this type of conversation, which is badly needed.
Nevertheless, Iran agreeing to surveillance equipment maintenance was a big step that's raised hopes for at least wider talks to revive the JCPOA. That 2015 deal introduced additional monitoring conditions on Iran's nuclear sites, but Tehran abandoned those requirements after former U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew and reimposed sanctions on Iran. Western powers have been urging Iran to return to negotiations, arguing that time to save the nuclear deal is running out, with Iran's uranium enrichment levels growing by the day. So can crisis be averted? Well, to get a sense of what European policymakers might be thinking, I'm joined from Rome by former Italian diplomat Marco Carnelos. He was Italy's ambassador to Iraq, a special Middle East peace envoy, and has advised several Italian prime ministers on Iran. He is currently the CEO of his own consulting firm, MC Geopolicy. Marco, thanks so much for being with us. Is this agreeing to allow for repairs and upgrades to surveillance mechanisms real progress, in your opinion?
Yes, at least is a first step in order to go back to some sort of talks. I hope so. It's a minimal step because, as far as I understand, the agreement is just to allow the IAEA to maintenance the camera placed in the Iranian plants, and just to change the memory stick of the cameras that are supposed to verify what is conducted inside the nuclear plants. That in itself is at least the beginning of something, and we hope in the following weeks could be followed by more substantive talks between among the parties. I understand there are some problems, even fundamental problems in how the two parties address and approach the negotiation. The Americans understand that they want to do something different from the JCPOA that was signed 6 years ago. Right. Iran to stick first to the talks, the original one, the original deal, and then to see if it can be expanded. It's the first step of a very, very long path, in my view.
Right, but at least you feel the glass is half full, so to speak. I know you also feel that it is Iran that suffered from double standards and was really treated unfairly when it followed the rules of the JCPOA, but still saw, the rug pulled out from under them once Trump actually took office. Still, though, many argue that Iran needs this, it needs those sanctions lifted. So, in the interest of being pragmatic, what do you think Tehran can afford to concede?
Well, I cannot be in the mind of the Iranian leaders at the moment. I believe that the Iranian has a perception that have been fooled by the JCPOA because Iran respected the agreement signed in 2015. And it's not me that is saying that, it's the Vienna agency that has been making many reports in which the deal was fully implemented by Iran. On the other side, the lifting of sanctions has not been complete. And from the mere economic point of view, we can say that Iran so far has not benefited from the lifting of sanctions because especially American financial sanctions have been in place all the time, preventing all the nations in the world to carry out any kind of significant economic activity with Iran. In itself has basically emptied of any meanings the lifting of sanctions because no bank in any country has been ready to support any kind of trade deal between Iran and any other nation because they were afraid to incur in the financial sanction by the US Treasury. So between these two options, they prefer, of course, not to annoy the Americans.
Right. But talk about the issue of time here. I mean, we've heard a number of people say that time to revive the deal is actually running out. What kind of timescale do you think we're talking about here? Or do you have endless optimism that this can be revived no matter how long it takes?
Well, this could be a form of leverage applied by the American side when they say that time is not time is quite limited. Honestly, I don't know what the Americans have in mind when they say that there's a time limit. It could be definitely an attempt in order to apply pressure on Iran. As I could see in the last 2-3 years, so far the Iranians have not been, in a way, compelled to take any significant decision by this American approach. The simple fact that they accepted to allow the IAEA to come back and maintenance the camera in the plants is definitely an opening. It means that Iran doesn't want to close the door for the talks. We have to see which kind of proposal and an attitude is coming also from the other side. As they usually say, it must be two to tango.
Absolutely. So, as far as what the powers that be will be discussing right now at the IAEA, what do you think they're considering as far as the next steps should be to arguably convince the United States to also be more pragmatic and move forward with these talks as strongly as possible?
I mean, I don't know what exactly has been going on behind the scene in the so-called talks behind, because I understand that Robert Malley has been visiting, talking with Russian and other Europeans. Definitely something is brewing behind, but we have no clear idea. So far, I have to say, unfortunately, the Biden administration have not shown all the pragmatism that was attributed to it. Of course, there have been many other issues that have been basically distracting in a way the Biden administration. I hope that now with Afghanistan behind, maybe one of the more important issues as far as the Middle East stability is concerned, the beginning of the talks on the nuclear deal can be restarted. And I hope to see a different approach from the conceptual point of view.
Okay.
They went out of the agreement. The Americans should do the first step.
Okay.
Logic. We know that logic is not part of international relations, but this is another story.
Not always. That is true. Marco Carnelos, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. We greatly appreciate it. Well, let's broaden out the discussion now. And joining me in the studio is Borzou Daragahi. He is an international correspondent for The Independent and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mohammad Marandi is a political analyst and professor at Tehran University. And from Washington, D.C., we have journalist Negar Mortazavi. Thanks all so much for being with me. Borzou, I'll start in the studio with you. I mean, are we in the media somewhat exaggerating when we use words like breakthrough when it actually is only meeting the very minimal requirements here just to get back to the table?
I wouldn't call this a big breakthrough. I would call this a sort of Band-Aid that allows the possibility of a resumption in talks. You know, look, this is an issue that the IAEA is important in this issue. The Europeans are important in this issue. The Iranians are, of course, you know, they share a big part of the blame in the escalation of this issue. But this is primarily a Washington issue, and a another Washington debacle based on wishful thinking. And the wishful thinking in this case was that, you know, we have these sanctions in place from the Trump era. Let's use them to build leverage and pressure the Iranians to either come up with the same better deal that Trump couldn't get, or get the Iranians to commit to follow-on negotiations to improve the JCPOA. Experts warned the Biden administration repeatedly at the beginning that, you know, time is running out. You're going to face a hardline administration with whoever comes in after Rouhani. You've got a couple months. No, they listened to the blob again. They listened to the Washington fixtures, the people who got the Americans into Iraq, got the Americans into Afghanistan, the debacle that just ended there that was also based on wishful thinking. And now we're, you know, in the midst of another global crisis, again, based on Washington's magical thinking.
Right. Let me turn to Negar quickly, because you'll know as well there was a school of thought that believed that once Biden started his term, the U.S. could just very simply jump back into the Iran nuclear deal, and it's obviously been a lot more complicated than that. But I don't want to sound naive in saying this, though. Could there be a silver lining that more of the American hardliners might be looking for here, that we might see a higher level of compromise and we could end up with what Trump was actually after and having a better deal than the previous one? Or again, is that being very naive and overly optimistic?
Even I also couldn't agree more with Borzou, and I heard the end of Marco's discussion that I belong to that school of thought. I still belong to it. I think Joe Biden could have, if he wanted to, if he was willing to spend the political capital, he could have returned to the deal faster and easier than it is. We expected this to happen towards the beginning of his administration. And as Borzou very well said, we've been warning that the window of opportunity was short. This was the end of Hassan Rouhani's administration, a moderate administration. And Joe Biden lost that window of opportunity by delaying diplomacy for a few months, by making it complicated, because he's been unwilling to rejoin the JCPOA, to basically join the same table where Iran and the Europeans are sitting at. So these negotiations have to happen indirectly in two separate hotels, which completely slows down the process even more. There was a delay, there's a slow. And then now there's a hardline administration in Tehran, which is even more reluctant and less willing to sit down with Americans to negotiate and to resolve the problem. So I hate to be pessimistic at this time, but I just see the road ahead even more complicated and more difficult than what it was during that golden window of opportunity which Joe Biden lost. And I just want to add this, it's unfortunate because this deal, the JCPOA, it was a historic deal. It took a lot of time and energy to be made, and it was made by the Obama-Biden administration. Let's not forget, a lot of people in this current new administration were actually involved in the negotiations and in making that historic agreement. And now the deal existed on the paper. There just needed to be a return to an existing deal. Right. And that's why me and many like me thought that it would be easier and faster, but I guess it didn't happen.
Okay, Mohammad, I'm going to come to you in just a second. Go ahead.
Let me just sort of say how easy it would have been for the Biden administration on January 21st. January 21st, 2021, they announced, we're going to lift all of the Trump sanctions on Iran, just with one executive order. We're going to lift as much as we can. And the Iranians, you have 30 days or a month or whatever, 2 months to go back to the levels
Right.
of enrichment and stockpiles that we had under the JCPOA. If at the end of those 60 days you don't, we have to snap back the sanctions.
Yeah.
But let's just do it like this. And the Americans could have done that, and they didn't.
Yeah. So Mohammad Marandi, that window was lost. We've established that time and time again, actually. I mean, what happens now? Do you see this latest development as the Italian diplomat saw it, that we heard previously, that, okay, it's a good sign, it's a positive step forward?
Well, as usual, it is Iran that's showing goodwill, but this is basically kicking the can down the road. From the very beginning, the Iranians were pessimistic. In fact, I had 3 discussions with a key American think tank close to the Democratic Party, both before and after the US election. And I said that Biden is not going to sign any presidential decree. I said it repeatedly. And I don't know why the people in that think tank were insisting that it would be otherwise. It was, I think, obvious that's not how the United States functions. Just like when the Iranians and the Americans signed the nuclear agreement, the Iranians abided by their commitments in full, as the IAEA has pointed out repeatedly. And under Obama, the United States didn't abide by the deal. The Iranian central bank, till the last day of
Right.
Obama's presidency, was unable to link up to the international financial sector.
Okay, so just tell me
So
then,
right
if you
now,
see
what we-
this latest measure of goodwill on behalf of Iran as an actual step toward potentially reviving the deal itself, or is that going too far?
Well, it all really depends on the United States. The United States left the deal and tried to get a new deal. The Iranians stayed in the deal and continued to abide by its commitments, even though the Europeans and the Americans were implementing maximum pressure sanctions to torture women and children, basically. That's how human rights works in Europe and the United States. But after a period of time, when the Europeans, it was clear that they were not going to do anything about it, the Iranians began to decrease their commitments to their obligations, so we reach where we are. Now the Iranians basically have given the United States and Europeans a new opportunity. But the problem is that the Americans and the Europeans, what we saw in Vienna, was that they wanted to add elements to the
Right.
deal. They wanted to keep certain sanctions in place, and the Iranians are saying no.
Yeah,
It's either the JCPOA or no deal.
Okay.
Otherwise, if Iran wanted to appease the United States, they would have done it under Trump.
Yeah, so in many ways, you do feel, and some will agree with you, that we are exactly where we have been, basically since the Trump administration. But let me ask you then, Borzou, I mean, the bigger and more frightening question for the entire world really is how close Iran might be to actually having the material it needs to build a nuclear weapon.
I think the bigger question and more frightening question is, will there be a war between the U.S. and Iran over the issue? I think the bulk of the world is really not that terrified of the idea of one more, dodgy country having some, toys at its disposal, given the state of the planet right now. I think what would be more destructive is if this led to a conflict, and obviously it doesn't seem like it will lead to a conflict. The U.S. doesn't even have the stomach to keep a couple thousand troops in Afghanistan. It's trying to get out of Iraq. They're not going to go to war over this.
What about Israel, though? I mean, at least Netanyahu's out of the picture for now, but there are still some serious hardliners in Israel.
They'll do their sabotage operations. It's very unlikely that they would get the ability to do airstrikes. And those sabotage operations will just give the Iranians an excuse to go even more clandestine and harden their nuclear facilities even further. And, let's look at the trajectory of Iran's nuclear program and its technology capabilities over the last 20 years, despite the sanctions. And it's just not going to work.
Right.
What you need right now is some creative diplomacy on the part of the U.S., a gesture, something that surprises the Iranians, something that shows that there is some goodwill, that it's not under the cynical influence of a bunch of like the dregs of the Washington think tank world. And some kind of gesture of showing that they're actually interested in diplomacy instead of keeping on with the same tired slogans. Nothing is off the table. Iran will not have nuclear. This kind of talk is just tiresome.
But still, I mean, Negar, let me ask you. I mean, there is a mission on this planet among world powers to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I mean, that's what this nuclear deal is technically all about. Whether or not you think it should be genuinely a concern of the global public is another question. So now I'm asking how much you think Iran has actually been able to build its capacity and its knowledge since the United States pulled out of the deal. Knowledge that really can't be reduced once it is there. That would give the global community concern for the proliferation of nuclear weapons on Iran's territory.
There's been a movement for non-proliferation by powerful countries who do have nuclear weapons, one of which has used a nuclear weapon. And also the big elephant in the region, in the Middle East, is U.S. ally Israel, who has this nuclear power and is not even part of the NPT. But to your question, I don't think the calculation in Tehran, from what we've been observing in recent years at least, the calculation is not that they want to obtain a nuclear weapon, not even maybe get close to actual materials, but they want to acquire the know-how, because it's the knowledge that you can't bomb. It's the knowledge that you can't reverse. And it's this passing of the knowledge that will put Iran's foes and Western powers on the edge, but it would still be short of Iran actually getting into a nuclear weapons program. Now, that calculation might change at any time. There has been attempts in the past, but I think the calculation is that this is something that they're willing to risk. It is a risk, putting the others on the edge, but it's also something that's short of that kind of big escalation and conflict that Borzou was also warning about. I'm worried about more military escalation, not a full-on war, maybe, at least not under this Biden administration, but I am worried about military conflicts, maybe little conflicts here and there in the region, replacing diplomacy. Because if you don't have a sustained and constructive and successful diplomacy, then conflict is going to slowly replace it. Israelis are going to continue sabotage, assassinations, everything they've been doing, and it's just not going to be helpful for the region, not just Iran and the U.S., but also for the entire region. It's going to be dangerous.
Right. Regionally, it is interesting to note, though, and Mohammad, I'd love you to address this, please, because the Iraqi prime minister became the first foreign leader to actually meet with Ebrahim Raisi in his role as president. And they really spoke about kind of cooperating with neighbors and more regionally than rather Iran having to cooperate with Europeans and Americans in order to move forward and better his country. I want to hear quickly, we can play what Ebrahim Raisi had to say in that meeting with the Iraqi prime minister.
Despite what our enemies want, these relations can expand in different fields, and the expansion of these relations is not limited to these two countries. The roles our two countries play in the region and the world and in international relations can be very effective.
So, Mohammad Marandi, interesting to see there the apparent bond that seems to be in the works with that meeting between Iraq's leaders and the new Iranian regime. I mean, is that more where Iran might be looking to if all else fails, especially with the JCPOA? Will we see Ebrahim Raisi really looking toward those regional bonds, more with it building relationships with its neighbors, trade, etc., to build a stronger Iran?
Well, the Raisi administration is already tilting away from Europe and moving towards a more Asian-oriented foreign policy and also a more broad look at the global south, which would include neighbors and regional countries. And the irony, of course, in my opinion, is that the United States actually has hurt itself by sanctioning Iran, in the sense that its occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan were both partially failures because they tried to dictate terms to these countries. So when the people of Afghanistan cannot do trade properly with Iran, or the people in Iraq who overwhelmingly live right alongside the Iranian border, most Iraqis live from north to south, very close to the Iranian border, when they're not allowed to trade properly, then the economies of these two countries can't be productive, the countries can't develop properly, and thus, for example, in Afghanistan, that contributed to the increased animosity towards the US occupation, and the same is true in Iraq. So while the Americans are trying to harm ordinary Iranians, basically they're harming their own position in Iraq and, of course, in what we saw in Afghanistan.
Okay, Borzou, go ahead. Quick final words.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, the maximum pressure completely failed. These sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on Iran have not collapsed the Iranian economy. It appears that the Iranian economy has somewhat turned a corner. They're not reeling. It's not in a free fall. Yeah, the economy is not doing great, but a year and a half into a global pandemic, whose economy is doing great? So, you know, the sanctions that the U.S. imposes that they think of as leverage are not accomplishing anything. They're just poison for the diplomatic environment. Meanwhile, they're not really having that much of an effect anymore on Iran. The worst of it is over for Iran.
So, Negar, very quickly, is that to say that if the JCPOA is not revived, Iran can continue as is?
Sanctions have been successful in putting pressure on the Iranian people and the public, vulnerable populations, middle classes, working classes. But as far as policy change, nothing. It has achieved none of the policy goals of the Trump administration or this new administration who's trying to use sanctions as leverage. So I agree, it's been a failed policy. And under the Obama administration, they concluded that diplomacy is the way to go. I'm just surprised that part of the same team now with the Biden administration is trying to change course and not go down the diplomatic path. So I think, yes, this will just continue. I just hope it doesn't escalate into something more dangerous.
Right. Negar, I will have to let you have the last word because we are unfortunately completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember to follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.